We have our speaker here today, and Brent, do you want to introduce him with your flyer that you sent me up? I have it on my screen. You may bring it up, or you're going to bring it up? And we'll welcome Doug. We're going to have you go first, Doug.
Yeah, absolutely. So great. Mark invited Doug to our meeting today. He spoke at SIRS before. Doug Bonetti is a California native, has a great background in education and so on, and as a historian for different history backgrounds, especially the Civil War. He speaks to high schools, veterans clubs, sons and retirements, of course, and just a great story. And he's got a huge presentation for us. So hopefully we can all enjoy that, and we'll let you take it from there, Doug. I think you're good to go.
Okay, thanks, Brent.
I'm going to silence everybody, please, Brent. Everybody, please put yourself on mute.
Okay. Brett, did you turn it over to me?
You have access.
Okay, here we go.
Ready to go.
Okay, for those of you who have seen me before at SIRS, and I have spoken to practically every SIRS in the Sacramento region, the very first talk I gave, in fact, the current president pulled me aside and says, "We have standards for a successful speaker here at the SIRS." I said, "What are they?" He goes, "Number one, does anybody fall asleep during your talk? And when you talk right after lunch, that is a challenge." So he says, if you do that, you're pretty good. And secondly, are you better than the best speaker we had in the last 20 years? And I said, "Well, who was that?" He goes, "It was a mortician on low-cost funerals." So he goes, "At the end of your talk, if I give you 2 thumbs up, that means no one fell asleep and you're better than the mortician." So I knew I had a pretty good gig when he gave me 2 thumbs up. So hope you enjoy the talk today. I think my preference would be if you would write down your questions and hold them to the end, because I know I have a limited amount of time here. I'd rather go through the deck and then take your questions at the end. So the question I want you all to ask yourself is, do you think the rebellion, the United States Civil War, is over? Take a minute to think about that. Virtually every talk I've given over the last couple years, it's really rare where someone raises their hand to say it's over. What year do you think this was taken? I will tell you, it was in the South. It was where General Sherman and his Yankee army marched through as they're toward the end of the war. Someone paid out of their own pocket, and that's a big billboard, noting that Sherman was a terrorist, an arsonist, and a thief. What year do you think it was taken? 2018, outside of Hilton Head. When you take my class at the Renaissance Society at Sac State, which we'll talk about later, very reasonable cost to attend, we do a tour of the old Sacramento Cemetery on Broadway and Riverside, and there's actually 220 Union veterans buried there. And there's about 7 rebels. And this is my favorite rebel tombstone. His name is Charles Sullivan. He was with the 12th Tennessee Cavalry, and when we pre-ordered his tombstone, he told the firm to make a tombstone with a point. And the individual who was carving it said, "Well, I've never had a request like that. Why?" He goes, "Do you think I want some damn Yankee sitting on my grave?" So I thought, man, to the bitter end, that guy is still fighting the war. So what do we call the United States Civil War? It's the Civil War. It's the rebellion based on all records kept in the Library of Congress. If you were born in the South, and I don't mean Southern California, it was the war between the states. If you're also from the South, it was the War of Northern Aggression. Some call it the Little Unpleasantness. So today, this is what I want to talk about. Is the war really over? I'm going to have you write down your guess of what the artifact I'm going to show you is. When did we suspect a rebellion was possible? The founding principles of the Confederacy and why it's never taught in the Southern states. I bet some of you are interested in my opinions on monuments. We'll talk about that toward the end. And then we'll talk about the nature of loss, how incredibly difficult time it was, and almost 3% of the population in America at that time perished in the Civil War. So this is one of the few replicas in my in-home den / museum. Almost everything I have in here is original. I share it with my classes. If you take my online class in February, you'll see artifacts. They're virtually all original, but this one is not. My wife acquired it for me. It's a glass vial from a shop in Tennessee. The original with a letter describing its use was $2,000, so she got me this $5 replica. And for perspective, it's up against a $5 bill. So write your thoughts down on that, and we'll talk about it at the end.
Excuse me, Doug. May I ask
Not
something?
seeing.
Sure, go ahead.
You're not sharing your screen, so we're not seeing what you're trying to show us.
Right.
Oh, shoot. All right, hang on. Share. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. How about now? How about now?
I see the Saber.
Very
Do you
good.
see the Saber?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, let me back up and show you the vial. Okay, this is what I was talking about. It's a glass vial. It's 1.5 inches in length. I gave you a little comparison versus the $5 bill. I want you to write down what you think it is, and then let's talk about it at the end. This is the Saber that if we were live, I would bring into the class or into the SIRS meeting or whichever the Lions Club meeting. This is actually made in 1860 from a firm named Mansfield and Lamb, and as soon as the war ended, this firm went out of business. When my wife acquired it for me, the guy who sold it to her said, "This saw action in the Civil War." And I said to Laura, I said, "This has to be the line of everybody in a shop in Gettysburg." And she says, "No, he was adamant. He knew the family and was convinced it saw action." So brother-in-law cleaned it with a light sheen of oil and found 8 notches at the base of the blade. And it's a little hard to see, but you'll see little ticks off of notches on there. And I used to show this to my teenage daughter's boyfriends and help them understand how important it was to bring them home on time. And if they didn't want to be notch number 9, then please bring them home on time. And those girls were never late. So it worked out pretty wonderfully to show them that Saber. Quick, who is this? You can even unmute yourself and tell me who you think it is. Why, it's young Abe Lincoln. Very good. When I showed this to a high school, and I won't tell you the name of the high school, one of the students in the back of the room practically jumped out of his chair and said, "I know who this is." I said, "Who is it?" He goes, "That is Richard Milhouse Nixon." And I knew the teacher really well, and I looked at him and said, "Let's keep that boy behind at least 1 year." And he goes, "Hey, he knew Nixon's middle name, so let's make sure we move him ahead on just that." And I said, "Okay, move him on." Who wore the coat who made the coat that Nixon, that Lincoln wore that night at Ford's Theater? And it was Brooks Brothers. Brooks Brothers has, I think, clothed every single president since the 1800s. So just pretty amazing in terms of their history. Do I still have you guys on the screen?
Yes, we're back.
I think
Okay.
Taft used a tent maker.
Is there a way to make
Yeah,
it larger, the whole screen?
He
rather
was a big boy.
Hey, Doug, we're seeing your screen, but if you can change to presentation
screen?
view on
Okay.
the PowerPoint, slideshow view, I should say.
Okay, here we
There you
go.
go. That's much better.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
The reason why I'm fascinated by the Civil War is no more books have been written in American history about one subject than the Civil War. 200 new titles every year. There's over 60,000 books written on the Civil War. It is the seminal moment other than the founding of our country, and it just does not seem to not go away. William Faulkner says the past is never dead. It's not even past. T.S. Eliot wrote about the English civil wars of the 17th century and wondered, can any serious civil war ever end? Many cultural anthropologists think it takes centuries for the passion of the Civil War to subside. This is pretty amazing. Here is John Adams' wife, Abigail Adams, in 1792. And she said, if I live 10 more years, I'm just sure I'm going to see division of the southern and northern states. Great quote from Charles Francis Adams to his son in June of '64. As I write the date, my mind returns to when we were first subjected to the baptism of blood under the necessity of maintaining a great idea, and that great idea is America. President Lincoln in Philadelphia in '64 said, war at best is terrible, and this war of ours in its magnitude and duration is one of the most terrible. War devastated so much of the South. 25% of all white men died for the Confederacy, and it really took them over 3 generations to begin to approach the economic size of the North, and never really caught up. 20th century Southern poet Alan Tate noted that the South retains a knowledge of war history carried to the heart. Robert Penn Warren, in his incredible book on the legacy of the Civil War, said, if you grew up in the South, it is truly felt history. Many Americans have a storehouse of knowledge and lessons drawn from that conflict. Let's put the Civil War in perspective to today's Afghanistan and Iraq wars. The sad count of over 19 years, particularly in Afghanistan, is over 7,000 lives and 22,000 wounded. If you've ever been to Antietam, just understand in 12 hours, 23,000 killed and wounded. So that's an incredible perspective of 1 day's worth of battles in the Civil War. The impact of the war, over 10,000 engagements fought coast to coast. The final engagement was fought actually in near Alaska over whalers. Over 54,000 died in prisons, and that's almost the same number that died in Vietnam. Combined, over 750,000 dead. That is a larger number than all the wars we ever fought prior to the Civil War and after. Over 1.3 million wounded in the Civil War. 80% of 16 to 45-year-old white men in the South fought in the war, and about 50% in the North, but they never tapped into an older group like they did in the South. Let's talk about the true cause of the Civil War. Always obscured. If you grew up in the South, you never really understood. In grammar schools and high schools, you always had the perspective of slaves, of states' rights, but it really is and always will be slavery. In 1790, there were 100,000 slaves in the North, 500,000 in the South. It was the largest asset in the South other than land. There were 4 million slaves in the South at the rebellion's outset. 2/3 of Southerners had no slaves, but look at where the power reside and who had slaves. 6 of the first 10 US presidents had slaves. 2/3 of the Supreme Court owned slaves. Many men, over 100, made their living in Charleston as slave traders. 44% of the population in the 11 states made up the Confederacy at the start of 1860. Well, they had their own founding convention in Charleston, and their very first article protected slavery, should never have anything that would impair the right of property of owning slaves. President Jefferson Davis reminded the Confederacy, as it exists, slavery is a moral, social, and a political blessing. When Mississippi voted to secede, they noted it was a blow at slavery, is a blow at civilization. The Confederacy defined, I call it the very famous Cornerstone speech delivered by their Vice President, Alexander Stephens, said, our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is actually a very natural and normal condition. I had one of my students, incredible resume. He was a captain, West Point captain, fought in Vietnam, a lawyer for over 40 years, grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and never once heard about the Cornerstone speech. And I reminded him, why would you, as a young man growing up in Charleston? It was something they would never talk about to their children. The prisons of the Civil War, I touched upon that. At one point, all prisons combined, North and South, held 500,000 men. If it were a city, Andersonville in Georgia would have been in the 5th largest city in the Confederacy. That camp was designed for 15,000 men. At one point, they held 41,000 within the stockade, and that gave you about 6 feet to lay down. And there is a very famous picture of Andersonville and Union captives. There's one of the mass graves in Andersonville. And, you know, the North was not totally innocent. They built a camp on the shores of Lake Michigan in Camp Douglas. And just from the weather and the lack of nutrition, over 6,000 rebels died there. So the North wasn't terribly innocent when it came to prisons either. There's one of the few pictures of Lincoln lying in his coffin as he made his way to his final resting place in Springfield. Over 1 million people, whether it be in person or viewing the train, watched him as he moved to his final resting place. One writer was not alone when he predicted the development of things will teach us to mourn Lincoln doubly. Ralph Waldo Emerson, speaking on the assassination of Lincoln, said, "Old as history is, and as manifold are its tragedies, I doubt if any death has caused so much pain as this has caused or will have caused on its announcement." Told you up front I'd talk about the nature of loss. Some New England towns lost 60% of males aged 18 to 35. Just during the war, there were only 2 books written on the afterlife, and then the 5 years after the war, 80 books were written on the afterlife. And the best-selling book in 1868 sold more copies than even the Bible that year, was a book called The Gates Ajar, and it was really what did heaven look like for soldiers. In the South, it was even more devastating. The death rate was 3 times that of the North. In North Carolina, Polly Ray lost all 7 sons to the war. A mother in Georgia had 4 sons killed at Gettysburg, and when she got the letter, they captured the death of all 4 sons in one letter. Catherine Cooper of Tennessee had 10 sons. 5 were killed, 4 were crippled for life, and 1 survived. The devastation in the South, where most of the battles occurred other than Gettysburg and then the invasion of Maryland and Antietam, 2/5 of all the rebel livestock in the Civil War perished. In that 10-year period from 1860 to 70, the wealth in those 11 states declined by 60%. And it's estimated it still took 30 to 40 years to begin to catch up, but never really could exceed the success of the North. I have been to this cemetery. There are 18,000 unknown rebel dead placed, actually repatriated from battlefields all throughout the North and the South, paid for by the Daughters of the Confederacy, 18,000. They actually petitioned Congress to help pay for the repatriation of bodies from Gettysburg, and Congress refused. And at the time, that would have been a $2 cost per soldier to bring them back to the South. So you don't forget that kind of sadness and that kind of tragedy. I imagine some of you have seen or have heard a lot of comments about Civil War monuments to remove or not to remove. Is a really interesting question. Roger Kimball, who was the editor of the New Criterion, I think hit a home run when he talked about monuments. Monuments are an attack on the past for failing to live up to our contemporary notions of virtue. And here's a good one. This is Roger B. Taney, who was the chief of the Supreme Court, was on the grounds of the Maryland Capitol. When they looked at what he did in the past, which was he's the one who essentially wrote the Dred Scott decision, which is considered the worst decision in the history of the country. It's the one where essentially Dred Scott, a slave who lived in North for many years and his master died, he sought to be free. And Roger Taney said you had no standing as an American citizen and never could. They actually shrouded this statue and then eventually pulled it off the Maryland Capitol grounds. And I think they made a huge mistake because I think there are, in select opportunities, there's great chance to provide education. My feeling is they should have built a bigger statue of some great American like Frederick Douglass right across the way from him and recounted his incredible life, which was escaping slavery at age 20, became a worldwide abolitionist hero, and continues to be a symbol of justice to all Americans. What a huge missed opportunity to educate young people who I guarantee you, majority didn't even know who Roger B. Taney was. So why the war doesn't end? And I think it's captured really well here in the outgoing president of the American Civil War Foundation in Richmond, Virginia. His name is Waite Rawls. And he talks about each generation seeks to shape the memory of the Civil War, the rebellion. And Lost Cause writing, which talked about this, if you've seen Gone with the Wind, the first 5 minutes helps you understand how they tried to rewrite history, talked about this genteel land of cavaliers and how the South was so different. That really started in 1867 from some retired Civil War Confederate generals. Initially, the effort with monuments was to memorialize courageous white men on both sides. But over time, women acknowledged, especially in the 70s going forward, that there was more here. So women were finally acknowledged in the Civil War. And the 60s Civil Rights Revolution, as I see it, helped impact the way we look at African Americans. But every generation tends to shape the Civil War to its piece. So let me ask the group if you want to mute yourself and take a guess about what this vial was used for. And for perspective, it goes right to the topic I talked about, which is the nature of loss. So if anybody wants to unmute and take a guess.
I got written down arsenic.
Good. The others. This actually goes back a couple thousand years to the Egyptians. It's called a widow's vial. And the concept is, particularly in the South, you rarely even had a picture of your loved one that went off to war. And so many of them died, and you never, particularly in the South, recovered the body. So your neighbors would find out your relative had died. They would come over with this vial, and they'd stress, you need to capture your tears for a year. And after that, stopper up this vial, and you need to stop mourning. And I thought, what a brilliant way to cope with the fact that most of these people didn't even have pictures to remember their loved one by. So even though it's a replica, and I kind of wish my wife had spent the $2,000 for the real one with the letter that accompanied it, this is, I think, one of the more interesting replica artifacts I own. And this is from one of the great books of the Civil War from Mary Chestnut, who lived in Charleston. And I thought this was really appropriate. Grief, which can relieve itself by tears, is a thing to pray for. So here's how I want to close, and then I'll turn it up for questions. I've also sent some information to Brent. If you want to research your family in the Civil War, there's a paid website called Fold3. And then there's a free website called civilwarsoldiersandsailors.com. So if you have an inkling that you had a family member, please do the research and enjoy. I think you'll be wide-eyed and very interested. I had one of my students in year 4 research her family and found she had 2 uncles that fought on different sides, and fought at the Battle of Shiloh, and both survived. And if you have any interest in my class, I'm going to send registration information for, we start February 11th, and I'll send that information to register to Brent, and he'll share that with you as appropriate. And my class sells out pretty darn fast, so I recommend you register online around mid-January. We have 100 classes typically, all available now through the week. And you can sign up, and I think it's around $65 for as many classes as you can squeeze in. So let me stop sharing and then turn it over to you all for questions. Hope you enjoyed it.
Very good.
Thank you very much, Doug. Let's see, is there any questions out there? Wow, you made everybody thinking.
I thought
here.
I'd have at least one Southerner who wants to challenge me.
Hey, yeah, Mark?
Go ahead, Doug. Go ahead, Ernie.
Yeah, I don't really have a question, just a comment. Great presentation. This is Ernie. But your first question, I think makes you really kind of ponder, you know, is the Civil War over? And I think there's remnants of it all over the country, and that's what we're seeing right now. I mean, the obvious difference between white supremacists walking and marching and Black Lives Matter people, and even in our own club, the absolutely dramatic difference in reality and perceptions, you know, around the current president. I think all that's symptomatic. It's two completely different ways of thinking, understanding, and perceiving reality, and I think it has roots in the feelings and the ideology surrounding the Civil War. Anyway,
Right.
So it was a great question.
I had a student that grew up in Missouri, and Missouri was actually a real hotbed of secessionism and Civil War anger and battles. And his wife had passed away, and he went back to a class reunion, and he met and fell in love with a woman who lived on the north side of town. And his relatives went out of his way and said, "Don't forget, that is the rebel side of our city. And if you choose to marry her, realize you are going back and you're associating with the rebels." And he said, "I just couldn't quite get over it." And the guy was in his 70s, for God's sakes, you know, let him have a good time. And the family made sure to understand this is something we really don't find acceptable. The other interesting thing about how the war is not really over and how it reverberates, there was a huge statue on the Ole Miss campus in Mississippi of a rebel soldier, private, always revered. Everybody was always impressed with the scale of this thing. Well, someone did their due diligence and understood why that statue was put up, and found out the original speech in 1901 was a tribute to all the rebel veteran soldiers who helped stop a lot of the efforts of Reconstruction after the Civil War. So once they understood that, they made sure to tear that statue down and help people understand this is why that statue had to be removed. But Ernie, you're right. I think there's a reverberation here of history that I think it's going to take another 3 to 5 generations for the rebellion to finally end and its impact to end. But civil wars are the worst wars of all historically, and they just don't seem to easily go away over time.
Thank you.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah,
Sure.
Steve?
Okay, I guess
Go
I'm
ahead,
a very negative person, but this goes back to something further than that. Human nature requires scapegoats. We had them in World War II with the Jews, and if we tear these statues down, whether they're good or bad, we're asking for the future to repeat itself. And it goes back to human nature. People are not very nice. Like, is there a civil war? There's a civil war right now in the United States. The middle America versus the coastal states, there's a civil war going on there, a much smaller one. But, it just, people aren't happy unless they can't hate something. And it happened to the Jews. And then if the blacks weren't here, the Jews weren't here, we'd hate the Indians or the Mexicans or something else. It's sad, but that's the way I feel. It's just part
So
of
it's
human
not
nature.
all people, Dave.
Unfortunately, I disagree with you.
No,
Let's
well,
see.
yeah, I guess you.
You might think you're better than that, but you've got something inside of you
Exactly.
that is stronger. It's called heredity. And
Yeah.
heredity
I say
requires...
speak for yourself.
Well said, Dave.
Okay, Steve. Go ahead, Steve.
See, we started a rebellion right there.
Yeah,
David,
boy, I better
thank
get
you.
out of here.
Steve.
Yeah,
I have
yeah.
a question for Doug.
Okay.
Doug, Douglas, I got a quick question. Your classes that'll be in February, is that going to be during the day? Is it going to be by television? How are you going to handle those?
Well, I wish it was face-to-face, but Sac State has already said that their entire year is going to be Zoom classes. So we're obliged to parallel what Sac State does. Our hope is Renaissance will be back on campus in fall of 2021, face-to-face in classes. We may limit the size of a class. My classrooms typically hold 50. I have a feeling they'll cap us around 30 or so. But my class starts February 11th, and it's all online, except for one field trip that we will take to the old Sacramento Cemetery with a docent guided tour that really is fascinating.
Thank you.
Well, the reason why I raised
Ernie, please don't speak. Steve, please speak.
Yeah, I have a quick question. I'd be really curious to know if there are any statistics relative to the mid-late 1800s that indicate what percentage of the South might be considered by today's definition white supremacists.
Well, you had the growth of the KKK that coincided with the efforts of Reconstruction and the Freedmen's Bureau throughout the South. And many of the KKK units were made up of veteran rebel soldiers. So Andrew Johnson, if you want to think of one of the great tragedies in American history, not only was it Lincoln's assassination, but the guy who should have followed through and killed Andrew Johnson, we would have had anybody better than Andrew Johnson as a president during the Reconstruction period. He essentially turned more than a blind eye to the transgressions that were going on in the South with the movement of the KKK and the thwarting of the Reconstruction efforts. It was Ulysses Grant, when he became president, that helped squash the KKK. But the damage had already been done. You know, the blacks that were trying to become good U.S. citizens, get educated, it was a struggle, and it was a struggle that went on for decades. But the rise in the South of white supremacy came with the invention of the Lost Cause that said, gosh, this is all about states' rights and what a different country we were than the North, and then the rise and eventually the fall of the KKK. But it became very profound after the end of the Civil War.
Yeah,
Hey, Carl, I know Carl had one more question. I think he was trying to ask one more question.
Yeah, my grandson is a senior in high school in Colfax. And the question I'm wondering is the fact that he's very interested in what's happening in the Civil War and the history, and he's very intelligent.
Uh-huh.
I was wondering, is there any way that, is this held during the day, your class and the time, so he could sign up and participate and so on?
My class is going to be on Thursdays from 12 to 2. So he has to join the Renaissance Society. Maybe you join, and then he comes in on your membership, and possibly during his lunch hour, he could join us for a little bit from 12 to 1. I don't know when their lunch hours go,
All right,
but
good.
Okay. And typically
Well,
I'm happy to speak at high schools and grammar schools, but obviously that's not going to happen.
June, you had a question? Go ahead, June. Then Joe.
Question. So I was not clear, Doug. What's the position now, or your position, and I'm sure there are many positions out there on the monuments. Monuments, should we remove them? Should we keep them there for posterity and the historical value and education? Or what's the stand on that? What's a popular position on that?
You know, it's I think the closer you are to them, and particularly in the South, the more volatile the opinions are. My opinion is first and foremost, the hell of the mob should be able to have the right to make a decision about the placement of a monument in any city in America. And the reality is a lot of these monuments have been defaced and torn down because of mob action. And I monumentally, kind of a pun, disagree with that. What I do believe in is I think communities should have a voice in where those monuments stay. Do they remain? Are they put in a museum? But most of all, I think there's this missed educational opportunity. When I talked about Roger Taney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision, and they threw a black drape over him at first, when all this controversy hit, and then removed his statue, and who knows where it's at now. I think you just missed this opportunity to have a plaque that explains what made him so notorious. And then secondly, why not build a statue of Frederick Douglass right next to him and explain Frederick Douglass was a man that he thought never could be an American. And Frederick Douglass became one of the great Americans of all time.
Thank you. Joe.
Yeah, just two quick things. In Sacramento, they removed John
Sutter. You're right.
And
right.
also Christopher Columbus.
Right.
And to me, this is just my personal opinion, but
right.
There aren't that many people that in our history that didn't own slaves or didn't control thousands of people like Indians and stuff like that. To me, it was a mistake to tear both of those down or take them down.
Yes.
The other thing I want to just mention is my sister has done our genealogy and found that my great-grandfather was actually a Union soldier at Appomattox during the surrender. And
wow, amazing.
Okay.
Just amazing.
Oh, great. Any more questions for our speaker, Doug? Thank you, Doug. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
You know,
Enjoyed
if
it.
we're at a meeting, I give you a pen and pencil for taking your notes and everything else. But since we don't have that, I want to thank you so much. I will definitely look forward to seeing about getting the Renaissance. I had that once and I misplaced the paper, but having speakers like you at Renaissance is amazing.
Thank you.
Great for our society.
And
Thank you.
I did send Brent the website that you can go and register for February for next year. And I would love to see you guys in my class on a Zoom.
Well, thank you. You're welcome to stay on. We're going to start our meeting for forward, or if you have other things to do, you may leave, but we are going to
thanks
start
again,
with
guys.
our committee reports.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
Bye-bye.